Rain hammered against the windows of the Hartwell manor like the sky itself was trying to break in. It was the kind of storm that made you grateful for walls and warmth and the comfort of knowing you were safe. Grace Bennett had none of those things anymore. She stood in the grand foyer of the mansion, soaking wet, clutching a small backpack that contained everything she now owned in the world. Her uniform, the gray dress of a Hartwell household maid, was plastered to her thin frame. Water dripped from her hair onto the imported Italian marble floor. In front of her stood Marcus Hartwell, 34 years old, billionaire, owner of Hartwell Industries, and the coldest man she had ever met. "Please," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just let me explain. I didn't steal anything. I would never—" "The necklace was found in your room," Marcus cut her off, his voice flat and emotionless. "In your pillowcase. My wife's diamond necklace worth $300,000 hidden in the pillowcase of a maid who makes $40,000 a year? Someone put it there. I'm being framed. Please, Mr. Hartwell, I've worked for this family for 2 years. Have I ever given you any reason to doubt my honesty?" Marcus's expression didn't change. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds, looked at her like she was something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "My wife gave me a reason tonight. That's enough." From the top of the grand staircase, Victoria Hartwell watched the scene unfold with a small smile playing at the corners of her perfect lips. She was beautiful in the way a snake is beautiful, all elegant lines and hidden venom. Her blonde hair cascaded over her silk robe, and her blue eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Darling," Victoria called down sweetly, "don't waste any more time on her. The police are on their way. They can handle this trash." Grace's blood went cold. "Police? You called the police?" "You stole from us," Victoria said, descending the stairs with theatrical grace. "Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" "I didn't steal anything." Grace's voice rose, desperation cracking through. "Mr. Hartwell, you have security cameras everywhere. Check the footage. Check who went into my room." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, just for a moment, just a shadow of doubt. But then Victoria reached his side and placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "The cameras in the staff wing were malfunctioning last week. Don't you remember? We talked about having them fixed." Grace saw the trap closing around her. Of course the cameras were malfunctioning. Of course there was no evidence. Victoria had planned this perfectly. "Why are you doing this to me?" Grace asked, looking directly at Victoria. "What did I ever do to you?" Victoria's smile widened just slightly. "I don't know what you mean. I'm the victim here. You stole from me." Grace understood then with horrible clarity exactly why this was happening. 3 nights ago, she had been cleaning the upstairs hallway when she heard sounds coming from the guest bedroom, sounds that didn't belong in a married woman's house when her husband was away on business. She had seen Victoria with another man, and Victoria had seen her seeing. This wasn't about a necklace. This was about keeping Grace quiet forever. "Marcus, listen to me." Grace grabbed his arm, abandoning all formality. "Your wife is lying. 3 nights ago, when you were in Tokyo, I saw her with—" The slap came so fast, Grace didn't see it coming. Victoria's palm connected with her cheek hard enough to snap her head to the side. The crack echoed through the marble foyer like a gunshot. "How dare you!" Victoria shrieked, suddenly hysterical. "You steal from me, and now you make up disgusting lies? Marcus, get this woman out of our house!" Marcus pulled his arm away from Grace like she was contaminated. Whatever doubt had flickered in his eyes was gone now, replaced by cold anger. "Security is escorting you out. You have 30 seconds to leave this property before I have you arrested for assault as well as theft." "Assault? She hit me!"
My wife was defending herself against a hysterical thief who grabbed her. His voice was ice. 30 seconds, Miss Bennet. Grace looked between them, the billionaire and his beautiful, lying wife, and felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, something else, something that had still believed in justice and truth and the idea that good people were eventually vindicated. That part of her died in the Hartwell foyer on that rainy night. She turned and walked toward the door. Wait! Grace stopped, a tiny flame of hope flickering. Maybe he had reconsidered. Maybe he had seen through his wife's lies. Maybe. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of cash. He tossed the bills at her feet. That should cover a bus ticket somewhere. Consider it severance. I never want to see your face again. The bills scattered across the wet marble floor. Grace looked at them, then looked at Marcus, and saw nothing human in his eyes at all. She left the money on the floor and walked out into the storm. Behind her she could hear Victoria's theatrical crying and Marcus's murmured comfort. The door slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Grace Bennet walked into the rain with nothing but the clothes on her back, $37 in her pocket, and a secret that she would carry for the next 5 years. She was 8 weeks pregnant with Marcus Hartwell's child. It had happened once, just once, an impossible moment of weakness on both their parts. Marcus had been drinking after a fight with Victoria, alone in his study at 2 a.m. Grace had brought him coffee, trying to be kind. Their hands had touched, their eyes had met, and somehow, impossibly, they had ended up tangled together on the leather couch, desperate and hungry and completely insane. He had avoided her for weeks afterward, pretending it never happened. She had been grateful for the pretense. It was a mistake, they both knew, a terrible mistake that could never be acknowledged. But now she carried the evidence of that mistake inside her, and she was walking into a storm with nowhere to go. Grace made it 3 blocks before the cold and the rain and the weight of everything that had just happened brought her to her knees on the sidewalk. She knelt there in the downpour, in the dark, in the ruins of her life, and she made a promise. She would survive this. She would build a new life, and one day Marcus Hartwell would know exactly what he had thrown away. 5 years later, Grace Bennet was dead. At least that's what the records showed. The woman kneeling in the rain outside Hartwell Manor had ceased to exist that night. In her place, a new woman had emerged, Dr. Grace Chen, one of the most renowned pediatric cardiac surgeons in the world. The transformation had taken everything she had. After leaving the Hartwell estate, Grace spent 3 months in a women's shelter, terrified and pregnant and utterly alone. But she had one thing Marcus Hartwell hadn't known about, one thing Victoria's background check had somehow missed. Grace Bennet had a medical degree. She had graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins, completed her residency at Massachusetts General, and been on track to become one of the youngest surgeons in the country. But then her mother got sick, her father died, the medical bills had piled up, and she was forced to take a leave of absence that turned into a resignation. Working as a maid had been a way to make money while figuring out her next move. The Hartwell position had been well-paying and came with room and board, which meant she could save almost everything she earned. She had planned to return to medicine eventually. She just hadn't planned on being fired, framed, and thrown out into the rain while carrying her employer's secret child. But desperation is the mother of reinvention. Grace had used her shelter time to study for her medical board recertification. She gave birth to a healthy boy, named him Oliver, and started over completely. She moved to Seattle, far from the Hartwell's New York empire. She completed a second residency, this time specializing in pediatric cardiac surgery. She published papers. She pioneered new techniques. She became, quietly and steadily, the best in her field. By the time Oliver started kindergarten, Dr. Grace Chen was being flown around the world to perform surgeries that other doctors wouldn't even attempt, and she never thought about Marcus Hartwell at all.
That was a lie, of course. She thought about him every time she looked at Oliver, who had his father's gray eyes and stubborn jaw. She thought about him every time she saw a news article about Hartwell Industries, the company that seemed to grow more successful every year. She thought about him every time she allowed herself to remember that night in his study and the morning after, when he had looked at her like she was a stranger and walked away without a word. But she didn't let those thoughts control her. She had built something beautiful out of the wreckage he had made of her life. She had a son she adored, a career she loved, and a future that belonged entirely to her. Marcus Hartwell was her past. Or so she thought. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Grace was in her office at Seattle Children's Hospital, reviewing scans for a surgery scheduled for the following week, when her assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Chen, there's a call for you on line 2. They say it's urgent." "Who is it?" They wouldn't say, but they mentioned something about a child with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Apparently, the case has been rejected by every major surgeon in the country. They're asking if you'd consider taking a look. Grace frowned. HLHS was one of the most challenging pediatric cardiac conditions, requiring a series of complex surgeries to reconstruct the heart's left side. She had performed dozens of these operations, with the highest survival rate in the country. "Put them through." She picked up the phone. "This is Dr. Chen." "Dr. Chen, thank you for taking my call." The voice on the other end was male, professional, with the clipped efficiency of someone used to getting things done. "My name is Robert Simmons. I'm the personal physician for a private family, and I'm reaching out about a 4-year-old patient who desperately needs your help." "Tell me about the case." "The child was diagnosed with HLHS at birth and has undergone 2 of the 3 standard surgeries. However, there have been significant complications. The heart is failing faster than anticipated, and the 3rd surgery, the Fontan procedure, presents unusual challenges due to the patient's unique anatomy. We've consulted with 14 different surgical teams. All of them have declined the case. They say it's inoperable." Grace leaned back in her chair. "If 14 teams have declined, what makes you think I'll be different?" "Because you've operated on cases they said were impossible before. Because you invented 3 of the techniques that would be required for this surgery. And because—" the doctor paused. "Because this child is going to die within 6 months without intervention, and you're the only surgeon in the world who might be able to save him." Grace was quiet for a moment. She didn't take cases based on flattery, but she also didn't turn down children who might die without her help. "Send me the files. I'll review them tonight and give you my assessment in the morning." "Thank you, Dr. Chen. I'll have everything to you within the hour." Another pause. "The family has asked to remain anonymous for now, if that's acceptable. They're quite private." "That's fine. I care about the patient, not the parent's social status." "Understood. You'll have the files shortly." Grace hung up and thought nothing more about it. Anonymous, wealthy families weren't unusual in her line of work. People with resources often sought the best care available, and privacy was a reasonable request. That night, after Oliver was asleep, she sat down with a glass of wine and opened the medical files. The case was everything Dr. Simmons had described: complex, challenging, and almost certainly fatal without surgical intervention. The child's heart was failing, and the previous surgeries had created scar tissue that made the standard Fontan approach impossible. But as Grace studied the scans and notes, she began to see a possible path forward. A modified technique, something she had been developing in simulation but never tried in practice. It would be risky, it would require perfection, but it might work. She was making notes on her tablet when she noticed something in the file she hadn't looked at yet: the patient's family history. Her eyes scanned the page automatically, looking for genetic factors that might affect the surgery. Father, Marcus Hartwell, 39, no significant medical history. The wine glass slipped from Grace's fingers and shattered on the floor. She stared at the letters until the letters blurred, until she couldn't breathe, until the room started spinning around her.
Marcus Hartwell, the man who had thrown her out into the rain, the man who had called her a thief, the man who was the father of her son. That man was now begging her, through intermediaries, to save his other child's life. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room, surrounded by the broken glass she couldn't bring herself to clean up, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Marcus had another child, a son according to the file, 4 years old, which meant he had been conceived around the time Grace was fired. Born to Victoria, the woman who had framed her, the woman who had slapped her and lied without blinking. This child, this boy whose heart was failing, was Oliver's half-brother, and Grace was the only person in the world who could save him. By morning, she had made her decision. She called Dr. Simmons and told him she would take the case. "That's wonderful news, Dr. Chen. The family will be immensely relieved. When can you fly to New York for the consultation?" "I'll be there tomorrow, but I have one condition." "Anything." "I want to meet with the family before I commit to the surgery. I need to understand the full situation, and I need to look the parents in the eyes." "I'm sure that can be arranged." "Good. And Dr. Simmons, I know who the family is. I saw the name in the file." A pause. "I see. Is that going to be a problem?" Grace thought about Marcus's face on that rainy night, the contempt in his eyes, the money scattered on the floor like she was some beggar to be paid off and forgotten. "I'm a doctor," she said finally. "I save lives. The child didn't choose his parents. I'll be there tomorrow." She hung up and went to wake Oliver for school. The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Grace arranged for her colleague to cover her surgeries, packed a bag for herself and Oliver — she wasn't leaving him behind, not for this — and caught a flight to New York. Dr. Simmons had arranged for a car to pick her up at the airport and take her directly to Hartwell Manor. The same manor she had been thrown out of 5 years ago. The same gates she had walked through in the rain with nothing. Now she was returning as one of the most celebrated surgeons in the country, holding the life of Marcus Hartwell's son in her hands. The irony was not lost on her. The car pulled up to the front entrance, and Grace felt her heart rate spike despite her best efforts at calm. She was a surgeon. She had held dying hearts in her hands without flinching. She could handle this. Oliver sat beside her, playing with his tablet, oblivious to the significance of where they were. She had told him they were going on a trip to help a little sick boy. He had accepted this with the easy faith of a 5-year-old who trusted his mother completely. "We're here," the driver announced. Grace took a breath, squeezed Oliver's hand, and stepped out of the car. The front door opened before she reached it, and there he was. Marcus Hartwell looked older than she remembered. There were lines around his eyes and gray at his temples that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He was still handsome, still tall and commanding, but there was something broken in him now, something desperate. He didn't recognize her immediately. How could he? Grace Bennett was a mousy maid, with her hair always pulled back, wearing a shapeless uniform and no makeup. Dr. Grace Chen was polished, professional, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who saved lives for a living. "Dr. Chen," said Marcus, extending his hand, "thank you for coming. I can't tell you how much this means to us."
Grace shook his hand and felt nothing.
She had expected anger. She had expected the old wounds to tear open at the sight of him. But standing here now, looking into the face of the man who had nearly destroyed her, she felt only cold, clinical detachment. He was a patient's father, nothing more. "Let's go inside," she said. "I'd like to meet Ethan." Marcus nodded and led her through the foyer, the same foyer where he had thrown money at her feet. Grace walked across the marble floor with her head high, and if Marcus noticed anything familiar about her, he didn't show it. Oliver trotted along beside her, holding her hand, his gray eyes taking in the grandeur of the mansion with curiosity, but no particular awe. He was used to nice things by now. "Who's that?" Marcus asked, glancing down at the boy. "My son," Grace said. "His name is Oliver. I hope you don't mind that I brought him. I don't leave him behind when I travel." "Of course, that's fine." Marcus barely looked at Oliver. He was too focused on leading them to his own son. They climbed the grand staircase, walked down a long hallway, and stopped outside a door covered in dinosaur stickers. Marcus knocked gently. "Ethan, there's someone here to see you." A weak voice answered. "Come in." Marcus opened the door, and Grace got her first look at the boy she might have to save. Ethan Hartwell was small for 4 years old, with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes. He was hooked up to monitors that tracked his heart rate and oxygen levels, and he sat propped up against pillows in a bed that was too big for him. But when he smiled at her, Grace saw something that made her breath catch. He looked exactly like Oliver. Same gray eyes, same stubborn jaw, same dark hair that fell across his forehead in exactly the same way. Because of course he did, because they had the same father. Grace maintained her composure through sheer force of will. She crossed to Ethan's bedside and knelt down so she was at his eye level. "Hi, Ethan. My name is Dr. Grace. I'm here to help you feel better." "Are you going to fix my heart?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "I'm going to try very hard," she said honestly. "Can I listen to it?" He nodded, and she pulled out her stethoscope. As she listened to his struggling heart, she was already calculating. The surgery would be difficult, but possible. With her modified technique, she gave him a 65% chance of survival. Better than 0, which was what he had without intervention. "You're very brave," you told Ethan when she was done. "I can tell you're a fighter." "My dad says Hartwells never give up," Ethan said, looking at Marcus with obvious adoration. Grace felt something twist in her chest. Oliver used to look at her that way, still did, and his father didn't even know he existed. "That's a good philosophy," she said, standing up. "Now, I need to talk to your dad about some grown-up doctor stuff. Will you be okay for a few minutes?" "Can he stay?" Ethan pointed at Oliver, who was hovering in the doorway, eyes wide as he looked at all the medical equipment. Grace hesitated. Her instinct was to keep the boys separate, to avoid any chance of Marcus noticing the resemblance. But Oliver was already walking forward, drawn by the dinosaur toys scattered around Ethan's bed. "I like dinosaurs too. That T-Rex is really cool." "His name is Rex," Ethan said, holding up the toy. "Do you want to play with him?" And just like that, the two half-brothers who had never met were sitting side by side, making dinosaur noises together. Grace turned away before Marcus could see her tears in her eyes. "Let's talk in my office," Marcus said. His office was exactly as she remembered it, minus the leather couch where they had made their mistake. That piece of furniture was notably absent, replaced by a more formal seating area. Dr. Simmons was waiting for them, along with another woman Grace didn't recognize, a severe-looking blonde in a designer suit who sat in the corner like a bird of prey waiting to strike. "Dr. Chen, this is my wife, Victoria." Grace's blood turned to ice. Victoria, the woman who had framed her,
the woman who had destroyed her life, the woman who was sitting right there, looking at Grace without a flicker of recognition. Because she had never really looked at the maid, had never seen Grace as a person at all, just an inconvenience to be eliminated. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "We've heard wonderful things about your work." "I'm here for Ethan," Grace said, not returning the pleasantries. "Let's discuss the case." For the next hour, Grace outlined her surgical plan while Marcus and Victoria listened. She explained the risks, the potential complications, the recovery process. She answered their questions with clinical precision. And the whole time, she watched Victoria. Something was off about her. The way she sat apart from Marcus, never touching him. The way her eyes darted to the door every few minutes. The way she seemed more annoyed than worried when they discussed Ethan's condition. This was not a mother terrified of losing her child. This was a woman going through the motions of concern. "I need to conduct some additional tests before I make my final decision," Grace said when the meeting ended. "I'd like to stay in New York for a few days to observe Ethan and review his complete medical history." "You can stay here," Marcus said immediately. "We have plenty of room. It would be easier than a hotel." Every instinct screamed at Grace to refuse, but staying in the house would give her access to Ethan, access to records, and possibly access to answers about what was really going on with this family. "Fine," she said, "but I'll need complete access to Ethan's medical files, including anything from his first 2 surgeries." "Of course, whatever you need." Marcus stood and offered his hand again. As Grace shook it, his eyes finally seemed to focus on her face with something other than desperation. "Have we met before?" he asked slowly. "You seem familiar." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression remained perfectly calm. "I have those faces. People say that all the time." Marcus nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "I suppose so. Let me show you to your room." That night, after Oliver was asleep in the guest room beside hers, Grace sat by the window and looked out at the grounds of Hartwell Manor. Somewhere in this house, answers were waiting. She could feel it. Victoria's behavior was wrong. The way she looked at Ethan was wrong. Something about this entire situation was wrong, and Grace was going to find out what. She spent the next 3 days running tests, reviewing files, and observing the household dynamics. What she discovered confirmed her suspicions. Victoria barely spent time with Ethan. When she did visit his room, it was performative, a few minutes of hollow affection, always when Marcus or staff were watching, followed by a quick exit. She never touched the boy with genuine warmth, never looked at him with a mother's love. Meanwhile, Marcus was falling apart. He barely slept, barely ate, spent every free moment at Ethan's bedside reading stories or just holding his hand. Whatever else he was, Marcus Hartwell genuinely loved his son. The son he didn't know was dying from something other than a congenital heart defect. Grace discovered the truth by accident. She was reviewing Ethan's blood work, looking for factors that might affect the surgery, when she noticed an anomaly. His selenium levels were slightly elevated, not enough to be obviously toxic, but higher than they should be for a child with no selenium supplementation. A suspicion formed in her mind, a terrible, horrible suspicion. She ordered more tests, secretly, without telling anyone. The results came back on her 4th day at the manor. Chronic low-level arsenic exposure. Someone was poisoning Ethan Hartwell. Grace sat in her guest room, staring at the lab results, her hands shaking for the first time since medical school. Arsenic in small doses could cause heart damage that mimicked congenital defects. In a child already born with a weak heart, it would accelerate deterioration, make a survivable condition fatal.
Someone was deliberately killing this child. And based on everything she had observed, Grace had a very good idea who. Victoria. But why? What could possibly motivate a mother to poison her own son? Grace needed evidence, proof that would stand up in court, and she needed to figure out how Victoria was administering the arsenic without being detected. The answer came to her at breakfast the next morning. She was sitting at the table with Oliver, watching the household routine, when she noticed something. Victoria personally prepared Ethan's breakfast smoothie every morning. She insisted on it, called it her special mommy recipe, and wouldn't let any of the kitchen staff help. She brought it to Ethan herself, watched him drink it, then took the empty glass away. Every morning, without fail. Grace waited until Victoria was out of the house, then slipped into the master bedroom suite. She searched carefully, methodically, using skills she had learned from years of surgical precision. She found it in Victoria's private bathroom, hidden behind a loose tile. A small vial of white powder. Arsenic trioxide. Grace photographed everything, replaced the tile exactly as she had found it, and retreated to her room to think. She had proof, but she couldn't go to the police yet, not without understanding the full picture, not without knowing why. That night she made a decision. She would confront Victoria privately, get her to confess, record everything, and then she would burn this woman's life to the ground. But first, she needed to tell Marcus the truth about his wife. She found him in his study at midnight, sitting in the dark, nursing a glass of whiskey. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment his guard was completely down. He looked exhausted, broken, human. "Dr. Chen? Can't sleep either?" "We need to talk." Grace closed the door behind her. "About Ethan, about Victoria, and about what's really happening in this house." Marcus straightened. "What do you mean?" "Your son isn't dying from his heart condition. Not entirely." She sat across from him, holding his gaze. "Someone is poisoning him. Small doses of arsenic over an extended period. That's why his heart is failing faster than it should." The color drained from Marcus's face. "That's impossible." "I have lab results. I have photographic evidence of arsenic trioxide hidden in your wife's bathroom. I have documentation of her being the only person who prepares Ethan's morning smoothie, the one thing he consumes every day that no one else touches." Marcus was shaking his head. "No, Victoria loves Ethan. She would never—" "Victoria hates Ethan." Grace's voice was cold. "I've watched her for 4 days. She can barely stand to be in the same room with him. She flinches when he calls her mommy. She's counting down the days until he dies." "Why? Why would she do this?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Lean forward. "And while we're sharing truths, there's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you the moment I walked through your door." "What are you talking about?" Grace took a breath. This was the moment she had been building toward for 5 years without knowing it. 5 years ago, you had a maid named Grace Bennett. Marcus went very still. You fired her, threw her out into a storm, accused her of stealing your wife's necklace. You threw money at her feet and told her you never wanted to see her face again. His eyes widened as recognition finally dawned. "No, that's not... You can't be..." "I'm Grace Bennett. I'm the woman you destroyed, and I'm the only person in the world who can save your son's life." The silence that followed was absolute.
Marcus stared at her like she was a ghost, and in a way she was. The ghost of his cruelty, come back to haunt him. "Grace," he breathed. "Oh my God. I didn't steal that necklace. I was never a thief. Your wife framed me because I saw something I shouldn't have." Grace's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. 3 nights before you fired me, I saw Victoria in the guest bedroom with another man. She knew I had seen them. She couldn't risk me telling you, so she destroyed me first." I didn't know."
You didn't want to know. You didn't even look at me when you threw me out. I tried to tell you the truth, and your wife slapped me across the face while you watched." Marcus's head dropped into his hands. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry. God, Grace, I'm so sorry. I believed her. She was my wife, and I believed her, and I—" He stopped, struggling to compose himself. "You have to understand, I was in a dark place back then. Victoria and I were falling apart. I was drinking too much. I wasn't thinking clearly. None of that excuses what you did. No, it doesn't." He stood up abruptly and walked to the window. "If you want revenge, I understand. Walk away. Let Ethan die. I deserve to lose him after what I did to you." Grace was quiet for a long moment. She had imagined this confrontation so many times, had rehearsed the words she would say, the accusations she would throw, the satisfaction she would feel watching him break. But now that she was here, she felt nothing like what she had expected. "I'm not going to let Ethan die," she said finally. "He's an innocent child. He doesn't deserve to pay for your sins or his mother's." Marcus turned, hope and confusion warring on his face. "You'll still do the surgery?" "Yes, but first we're going to stop Victoria from poisoning him, and then we're going to get her confession, and then she's going to prison for the rest of her miserable life." "How?" "Leave that to me." Grace stood up and walked to the door. Then she stopped. There was one more truth that needed to be told. "There's something else you should know." "What?" Grace turned to face him. "That night in your study, 5 years ago, when you were drinking alone and I brought you coffee, do you remember what happened?" Marcus's face went pale again. "Yes, I remember." "I got pregnant that night, Marcus." He staggered backward like she had physically struck him. "His name is Oliver. He's 5 years old. He has your eyes and your stubborn jaw, and he's sleeping in the room next to mine right now." Grace's voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Ethan isn't your only son, and Oliver is the reason I'm still willing to save his half-brother, even after everything you did to me." She left Marcus standing in his study, frozen in shock, and went back to her room. Tomorrow they would deal with Victoria. Tonight she needed to sleep. The confrontation with Victoria happened the following evening. Grace had spent the day preparing, consulting with a lawyer friend in Seattle, and coordinating with private security Marcus had hired once he understood the situation. Everything was in place. They gathered in the formal living room. Grace, Marcus, Victoria, and Dr. Simmons, who had agreed to serve as a medical witness. Victoria thought they were meeting to discuss Ethan's surgery schedule. She had no idea what was coming. "Before we begin," Grace said, standing at the head of the room, "I need to ask Victoria a question." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Me? I'm not the doctor here." "No, you're not." Grace pulled out her phone and displayed a photograph, the hidden vial of arsenic trioxide. "But you are the person who's been slowly poisoning your son for the past 2 years." The room exploded. Victoria leaped to her feet, face contorting with rage. "That's ridiculous! How dare you accuse me of—" "Sit down." Marcus's voice was ice. The warmth he had shown Grace the night before was gone, replaced by cold fury directed entirely at his wife. "Marcus, you can't possibly believe. Sit down." Victoria sat.
Grace laid out the evidence methodically. The elevated selenium levels, the arsenic in Ethan's blood, the hidden vial, the smoothie ritual, Victoria's behavior toward her son. By the time she finished, Victoria's composure had cracked entirely. Mascara-streaked tears ran down her face as she realized her carefully constructed world was collapsing. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice raw with pain. "Why would you do this to our son?" Victoria laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Our son? Our son?" She stood up, all pretense of the grieving mother gone. "Ethan isn't our son, Marcus. He isn't even mine." Marcus stared at her. "What are you talking about?" "I can't have children. I've never been able to have children. When you demanded an heir, I knew I had to produce one or you'd divorce me and I'd get nothing." Victoria's voice dripped with bitterness. "So I found a surrogate, paid her off, faked the pregnancy, gave you your precious son. But the DNA tests said he was yours because he is. I used your frozen sample from the fertility clinic, but I have no biological connection to that child." She spat the last word like it was poison. "He's just evidence of a transaction, a business deal that went wrong." "So you decided to kill him?" Grace's voice was sharp. "Because he wasn't really yours?" "I decided to simplify my situation." Victoria's eyes were wild now, all calculation replaced by desperation. "The prenup gives me nothing if Marcus divorces me, but if I'm a grieving widow, if Marcus dies of heartbreak after losing his only son, I inherit everything." The room went silent. "You were going to kill me too," Marcus said slowly. "Eventually, after a suitable mourning period, a tragic accident, another broken heart." Victoria smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Grace had ever seen. "I had it all planned out, but then this doctor appeared out of nowhere, claiming she could save Ethan, and everything started falling apart." "It's over, Victoria." Grace stepped forward. "The police are outside. Your confession has been recorded. You're going to prison for attempted murder." Victoria's eyes darted to the door, calculating her chances of escape. Then her shoulders slumped. "I suppose it doesn't matter anymore," she said quietly. "I was never going to win. Not really. Not against people like you." The police entered and led Victoria away in handcuffs. She didn't struggle. She didn't even look back. Grace watched her go and felt nothing but relief. The surgery happened 3 weeks later, after Ethan's body had cleared the arsenic and his condition had stabilized. It was the most complicated operation Grace had ever performed. 14 hours of precision work, rebuilding a heart that had been damaged by both nature and human cruelty. Twice she thought she had lost him. Twice she brought him back. When she finally stepped out of the operating room, exhausted but triumphant, Marcus was waiting in the hallway. "He's going to be okay," Grace said. "It will take time, but he's going to be okay." Marcus broke down completely. He sank into a chair and sobbed, years of fear and guilt and pain pouring out of him. Grace stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and let him cry. When he finally composed himself, he looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "How can I ever repay you? After everything I did, after what I put you through, you saved my son's life. You saved our son's life." "I didn't do it for you," I said honestly. "I did it for Ethan and for Oliver. Those boys are brothers, Marcus. They deserve a chance to know each other." "And us?" Marcus asked hesitantly. "Is there any chance? Could you ever forgive me?" Grace considered the question carefully. 5 years ago, she would have said no. She would have wanted him to suffer the way she had suffered. She would have demanded he feel every ounce of pain she had felt. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had built a new life, a good life, and there was no room for old hatreds. "I forgive you," she said finally, "not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Marcus nodded, tears still falling. "What happens now?" "Now you get to know your son, both your sons." Grace managed a small smile. "Oliver is going to need time to understand, but I won't keep him from his father. Every child deserves to know where they come from." "And us?" Marcus asked hesitantly. "There is no us, Marcus. There never was. We had one night and a lot of pain. That's not a foundation for anything." He looked devastated, but he nodded. "I understand."
"But," Grace continued, and he looked up with a flicker of hope, "we can learn to be good co-parents. Good friends, maybe, eventually. for the sake of our sons." "I'd like that." Marcus stood and extended his hand. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." She shook his hand and felt, for the first time in 5 years, truly free. 1 year later, Grace stood in the backyard of her Seattle home, watching Oliver and Ethan play together on the swing set. Ethan had made a full recovery. His heart was strong, his energy was boundless, and he had adapted to his new life with the resilience that only children possess. He lived with Marcus in New York most of the time, but he spent every school break with Grace and Oliver. The boys had become inseparable, brothers in every way that mattered. Grace felt a presence beside her and knew without looking that it was Marcus. "They're amazing together," he said quietly. "They really are." "I got the final reports from the lawyers today. Victoria's appeal was denied. She'll serve her full sentence." "Good." They stood in companionable silence, watching their children laugh and play. "I've been thinking," Marcus said finally, "about what you said last year, about us learning to be good friends. And I think we're getting there, don't you?" Grace looked at him, at the man who had once thrown her out into the rain, who had nearly destroyed her life, who had fathered her child without knowing it. He had changed in the past year, softened, become someone she could actually respect. "Yeah," she said, "I think we are." Marcus smiled, and it was genuine, warm, without any of the coldness she remembered from before. "That's enough for me," he said, "for now." He walked across the yard to join the boys on the swings, lifting Ethan up to push him higher. Oliver laughed and demanded his turn next. Grace watched them, her strange little family, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Peace. Complete, total peace. 5 years ago, she had walked out of this man's house with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby in her belly. She had been broken, betrayed, and utterly alone. Now she had a thriving career, 2 healthy children who adored each other, and a future that was entirely her own. The past couldn't be changed, the pain couldn't be erased, but it could be transformed into something beautiful. And standing here in the sunshine, watching her sons play with their father, Grace realized that was exactly what she had done. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into the best. And that, more than any revenge she could have imagined, was the sweetest victory of all. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more powerful stories about justice, healing, and the quiet victories that change lives. New stories every week.